Good afternoon, everyone. I have to say that I'm very impressed by the number of people in here. On Thursday afternoon, at a conference that's been going 4 or 5 days, so I think you all deserve some applause for that. I think it's also a great testament to your desire for more information how we can better manage weeds. I think we have a lot of room to improve on what we do, and I think that the number of people that are still in this room on a Thursday afternoon is a great testament to that. I'd like to thank the folks from the area-wide project for inviting me to be part of this symposium. I haven't been involved with it as much in the last couple years as I was initially, so it's nice to be here and to interact with a great group of people who are doing some really neat stuff with annual invasive grasses. So I'm at Montana State now, and we don't do as much with annual invasive grasses as maybe you do in the Great Basin, but I think that the concepts we're talking about here today can be applied across all invasive plants, not just invasive annual grasses. So what I'd like to cover today is I'm going to be focusing mostly on site availability, or that should actually say species availability. I can't believe I didn't catch that earlier than now. Okay. Species availability. So what do you do when you actually have to go in there and revegetate? I'll talk a little bit about these revegetation guidelines, and then just give a couple examples of how we've been testing EBIPM in revegetation situations. And I'd like to finish by throwing some ideas out there for some novel approaches to revegetation based on EBIPM and how we think about ecological processes. So you've all seen this diagram multiple times here already today. What I'm going to be focusing on really is species availability, not site availability, and really thinking about how can we put propagules of species back into a plant community that is so degraded that we wouldn't expect remnant plants to respond to our weed control treatments. So we're really thinking about revegetation. Like I said just a couple seconds ago, when we think about revegetation, we really are looking at those sites that are so severely degraded that we would not expect plants to come back on their own. They've crossed some threshold where we have the absence of desired vegetation. And if we simply control weeds, control invasive grasses without seriously thinking about species availability and putting species out there that we would like to have there, then we will, if we don't do that, then we're going to just end up with bare ground, or we're going to end up with more of the same weed that we've been managing, or sometimes you get invasion by a new weed that might even be worse, or maybe you get a suite of invasive species. For example, you get cheatgrass and yellow star thistle, something like that. So in situations like this, we recognize using the EBIPM model that revegetation is certainly necessary. Now, Brenda talked about with the grazing, she talked about the third scenario where you might have annual grasses everywhere, and and how those are places where you really sink a lot of money into trying to restore those types of plant communities. And that is exactly where revegetation comes in. It is very resource intensive, and a lot of times it doesn't work very well. So I think there's quite a bit of room for improving on how we do revegetation of rangeland, especially semi-arid rangeland. So that's kind of the theory or the idea behind how site species availability plays into EBIPM and why revegetation is so important. Now I'm going to take just a couple minutes to talk about some revegetation guidelines. This is a publication that's back there on the back table, so if you haven't picked one up, please do. You can also access it electronically if you like to look at things electronically, or you just have a friend or a colleague that you want to make sure they get exposed to this, but they weren't here to pick up a copy. So you can look at that electronically as well. Now, you'll notice that this particular publication, actually, we printed it shortly before the area-wide project really came into its full force. And surprisingly enough, the EBIPM model does not show up in this publication. I was looking very carefully through it. So I think that's something that we could maybe revisit in the years to come, in thinking about how we can more closely tie those two together. But if you go to the front couple pages of this guide, there's actually a 14-step process for you to walk through when you're trying to design a revegetation plan. And on the slide here, I narrowed it down to a 12-step, because it's hard to fit everything on one slide. And I also, when I'm in Montana doing extension and talking about this, I call it the 12-step program to reduce chemical dependency. So that's funny, because no one in Montana ever laughs when I say that. So I don't know, maybe we have more problems in Montana than we do the average person here at SRM. But and that's really what it is, because all too often we go out and we spray weeds, or we graze weeds, or we do whatever we do to weeds, and sure enough, if we don't think about putting something desirable back in there, with species availability, we get weeds back. And it's a dependency. So I don't have time today to walk through all these steps with you. This guide is really great because it spends a couple pages on each of these steps, giving you some guidelines to think about as you put together a revegetation program. What I like to use, or how I like to think about this 12-step or 14-step program, is to think about how these different steps really address site availability, species availability, and species performance. Because if you think about the whole process of revegetation, you're doing all of these different things at various times during your restoration or revegetation plan. So what I think would be really cool in the future is, because the EBIPM model has developed so greatly just over the last few years, is to kind of revisit this 12-step or 14-step program and really think about how these different steps fit into site availability, species availability, and species performance. So I think there's a lot of room to continue to improve upon this part of the model. Okay, so I'm not going to go through those steps. We could spend a whole day together going through those steps and thinking about how to design a revegetation program. What I'd like to do instead is just give you a couple examples of how we can use EBIPM and how we can think about ecological processes to maybe guide some of our revegetation programs. So one of the examples I'd like to show you was something that was actually tested in Montana, not necessarily at a site that was invaded by annual grasses, but it was invaded by sulfur cinquefoil and spotted knapweed. And it was termed augmentative restoration, and you'll understand that a little bit more when I talk to you about this site. But this is a picture similar. This isn't the exact site, but it's a similar area to where a lot of this research occurred. And what the researchers did, which I don't know, you can't actually see the citation on the bottom. It's Sheely, James, and Bard, 2009, Invasive Plant Science and Management. But what the researchers did was they actually located 3 locations in this area. One was, they called it disturbed. It already had quite a bit of disturbance present. It had one of the areas had remnant native population, so they called it remnant native. And then another area this was in an area with kind of like prairie pothole, that there was certain areas where there was a lot of fairly moist soils due to the ground water level. So they had these 3 areas, and then they kind of looked at, like this area, the disturbed area, they figured it already had site availability there. There were a lot of meadow holes, lots of disturbance, but it didn't really have any species availability or species performance. Water being what they would use to measure species performance. We know that plants like water, right? They have to have water. The remnant native didn't really have a lot of space for other things to get established there. It had some remnant species, but it didn't really have anything to address species performance. So they thought it would need some watering. Now this site, the wetland site, they figured it already had a good water table there. They could get species established. established, but they needed to do some disturbance and they needed to address species availability. So this is, I think this serves as a great example for how you can take this idea back to the sites you're dealing with, maybe use that rangeland health assessment idea to identify what is present and what is missing out of the EBIPM framework, so that when you think about revegetating or restoring, maybe you don't need to revegetate, you can put something together like this somewhere. So what they found then was they went back and they looked at, sampled plant density, plant biomass, and all that stuff. And they looked at what treatments resulted in the greatest establishment of seeded species. So the best outcomes of revegetation. At the disturbed site, remember, they didn't think they needed to do disturbance there. They did have plots where they disturbed, but they found that disturbing the site with tilling really didn't make a difference. What made a difference was seeding and watering for both native grasses and native forbs. So this site checked out, right? They didn't do the disturbance, that when they applied the disturbance treatment, didn't help. All they had to do was seed and water, because they already had all these disturbed soil from the voles. Now at the remnant native site, it didn't necessarily check out, because they found that they got the best native grasses and native forbs where they seeded. Okay, even though they tried tilling, they tried 2,4-D, seeding still made a difference at that site. At the wetland site, it did check out, because the treatments that gave the best establishment of seeded species was tillage and 2,4-D and tillage and seeding. So water to direct species performance was already present. They really didn't need that, and it checked out. So their conclusion in this paper was that in 2 of the 3 locations, using augmentative restoration based on EBIPM gave them better outcomes than if they would have just haphazardly applied treatments that they thought would work, okay? And Roger referred to this morning when he said that 67% of the time using this model improved revegetation outcomes, okay? So that's one example. Oh my gosh, where does the time go? Okay. I want to just, one thing I want to touch base on real quick, and Jeremy did a nice job of introducing you to the priority effects idea this morning, is when propagules arrive at a site can really make a big difference on what gets established there. Now we know annual grasses produce a lot of seed, and they germinate quickly. They germinate at slightly lower temperatures, and once they start growing, they grow pretty fast, right? Well, we wanted to look at, could you actually switch competitive relationships between something like cheatgrass and a native perennial grass like bluebunch wheatgrass simply by changing the time of arrival of those species. So this is some work that my graduate student had just finished up. And what we did was we had 3 different cohorts of bluebunch wheatgrass. We had a seed, we had a 2-leaf bluebunch, or we had a 4-leaf bluebunch. We established these plants in the greenhouse, and then we introduced cheatgrass seeds to the pots. We had different densities of both species to reflect what you might find in the field, and then we had some nitrogen treatments. And here's a picture of the greenhouse. You see the pots kind of have different combinations. I like this picture because it kind of shows how we have these different, this is 2-leaf bluebunch, kind of tall spindly stuff, and there's cheatgrass just coming up. So did that make a difference in the competitive outcomes between these 2 species? And we did find that if bluebunch emerged earlier, it was much better at avoiding suppression by cheatgrass. So here's bluebunch density, down here in the bottom, from 2 to 14 plants per pot. Cheatgrass density, 0 to 20 plants per pot. This represents when we seeded the 2 species together. This is when we let bluebunch get to 2-leaf. This is when we let bluebunch get to 4-leaf, and we added cheatgrass. Now you got to follow the little bouncing ball here. We have a pot here in this situation where we have 2 bluebunch plants growing together, no cheatgrass. And as we increase cheatgrass up here, see, follow that little ball. We increase it to 20. You can see that it's crossing quite a few different gradations of bluebunch biomass. I forgot to tell you that that's the range. bluebunch biomass per plant. When we get to a 2-leaf stage, the ball goes up, but you'll notice we don't cross quite as many colors, different shades of gray. When we got to the 4-leaf cohort, we pretty much stay in the same size bluebunch, even when we go from no cheatgrass up to 20 cheatgrass per pot. Bluebunch didn't care. If it's already 4-leaf, it doesn't care if cheatgrass is there doing its thing. And this just shows you the % reduction in bluebunch size at seed versus seed, 2-leaf bluebunch versus seed, and then 4-leaf bluebunch. So there's still competition occurring here. You can still there's some density-dependent competition, but it's a much less obvious decrease in bluebunch wheatgrass size if it's allowed to get a certain size before cheatgrass is introduced. I'm going to buzz. This is looking at the cheatgrass models. And what we found was that bluebunch that emerged earlier suppressed cheatgrass much more. We're looking at 31% effect on cheatgrass at seed versus seed, up to 72% in bluebunch's 4-leaf size when cheatgrass is introduced. So I think that's some pretty cool data suggesting that if we can do some things with management to change these size differences and tweak with those priority effects, we could have much better outcomes with our revegetation success. Okay, novel approaches to reveg. I'm going to go through this real quick. Site availability. There's just some ideas up there I think we could really start working with in our reveg programs to potentially have better outcomes when we think about site availability. And I've tried to provide some citations. What's really cool is that Tom Monaco and Roger Shuey have edited a book that will be coming out in May, around May, we hope. Chapter 10, I talked about these a whole lot more, but a lot of the people that you've seen on the agenda today have contributed chapters to this book. So hopefully you will get a chance to see that. Tom told me earlier today that he's paying anyone that will give it a positive review or something like that, and post it on Amazon. So here's species availability. These are just some ideas about what could we do that's kind of non-traditional. You know, usually right now we go out there, we spray, we seed, we do it all in 1 or 2 years. And then we sit back and hope something good happens. These are some ideas for how we might think about revegetation in a different way for species availability, and then for species performance. Just some different ideas. And I would encourage you to get a copy of this book when it comes out so that you can read a lot more about these ideas and more about some of the ideas that have been presented in this symposium so far. So I'm out of time.